want the guys working past 9 o'clock because they should be home with their families. Can you imagine any studio boss saying that today? That I don't want my employees working later than 9 o'clock because they need to be home with their families? That's the kind of guy Walt Disney was. He really believed in the family and that you shouldn't spend your evening, you know, and today we know people work around the clock, you know, and in some cases we've broken up marriages because the husband just never went home because he was working all the time, you know, around the clock, weekends, insane.
I've seen Floyd more than I've seen my wife for months.
Oh, good.
and in a work way.
A good example of this was at Pixar.
Good thing it was
At Pixar on Toy Story 2, 7 days a week.
Oh my.
Literally, 7 days a week.
Well, in our department at Disney, the secretarial and support staffs weren't that happy with us. They called us those zany cartoonists because we might leave at 4 o'clock or come in late, but what they never noticed that we were on salary, and if you read the fine print, it said 56 hours. So there were weekends that we had to work to finish a project. But I wound up at Disney completely by accident. I was lettering and inking Russ Manning's Tarzan Sunday strips and the Star Wars Daily and Sunday strip. And I stopped working with Jack Kirby because I wanted to stretch my muscles, and actually I wasn't stretching my muscles but lettering and inking for someone. And Sparky Moore suggested I go into Disney and pick up some work from their foreign comic strip division. And I went in and picked up a couple freelance jobs, and after a month or so, Don McLaughlin, who was the head of creative service, at least the department, and he said, "How would you like to come in and talk about your future?" And I'm thinking, oh, it'll be a steady freelance gig. And I came in and he says, "How would you like to come on staff?" And in less time than it takes to say, I said, yes. And for a guy that grew up wanting to draw Tarzan and Flash Gordon and all these heroic adventure characters, I found out that my bag was Bigfoot.
Welcome aboard.
What do you mean by that? Bigfoot?
Bigfoot?
Oh, no.
Well, Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers had small feet, and Mickey Mouse and the animated characters had big feet. And I don't know how common a term that is today, but when I was a kid, and in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, it was Bigfoot.
That's true.
That's what the comic guys would call you.
Our department was practically an overnight growth because initially I went back to Disney and working in the comic strip department, and at that time King Features, they were still syndicating Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, The Scamp, Floyd, and I, and a couple of others. We developed the Winnie the Pooh strips, and it was really, you know, well, at that time the comic strips were losing a lot of readership, but the studio had to pay benefits, health and welfare, pension, and whatever. So, you know, it wasn't a money-making deal. So they finally decided to take the entire comic strip department and turn it over to King Features bullpen. They had a bunch of artists that was turning it out. And so here became the end of an era, because there were so many good comic strip artists that dates back to the very beginnings of Mickey Mouse, and Floyd Gofferson and Al Taliaferro and all that. And, so what are they going to do with a bunch of us that were still there? And so all of a sudden a fellow comes out from Florida and forms the Disney merchandising department, consumer products, and practically overnight. Yeah. So if we hired people like Mike, it was out of desperation.
I love that. While we were still during this transitional period producing the strips for King Features Syndicate, I spent a few months as like the supervisor of the once a week get together with the writers, and we went over the scripts and stuff. And everybody knew that I was a cowboy at heart, and I went horseback riding in Lone Pine and Alabama Hills and so on. And so about the time they ended producing the strips, Don Ferguson wrote a special Winnie the Pooh daily strip, which was penciled and inked and lettered by the regular people that did the strip, and the original was given to me, and I still have it at home. And in the first panel is Pooh sitting on the strip, and Piglet is saying, well, what kind of a gag we'll have today? And then the next panel, Pooh says, well, make it cowboys. And the last panel is Piglet saying, yeah, because if it's cowboys, Mike will buy it.
Any questions? Any more questions?
Any questions from
Anybody
the
else?
audience?
Yes, sir.
Is Mr. Lassiter going to come back to Pixar?
That would be no.
Yeah, that's when you get the no. Signs point to no.
Yeah, John's busy at
Skydance.
Yeah, he's over at Skydance.
Okay, yeah.
Keeping his head down and getting his work
Don't
done.
worry, he's still rich.
Yes. And as Floyd will tell you, rich people are funny.
Right over here. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Hi.
Hi.
I would like to ask Floyd and Willie about their interactions with the 9 Old Men during their times at Disney.
Oh dear. That's a question.
Well, when I was there, all 9 Old Men was still very active, and of course working on the classic spaghetti kissing scene, which was animated by Frank Thomas. And so I spent a lot of time with Frank, and then of course Ollie. Milt Call was a little intimidating. He sat, Iwo Takamoto was his assistant at that time, and I would go into his office, and apparently that lunch hour, his chess moves weren't quite right. So that afternoon, he was rather in a bad mood. Ward Kimball and I shared the collecting Disneyana toy passion. And so, you know, it was fun to schmooze with him. But basically, those were my interactions with some of the 9 Old Men. I think Floyd had a little more active.
A little bit. I was lucky enough in the early 60s to spend 2 years with Milt Call. I worked assisting Milt on The Sword and the Stone, which started out, and that was after we finished the 101 Dalmatians, and I think, you know, my wife is calling. Yeah, let's see.
I'm a friend.
I'm on a panel. Yeah, I'm on a.
Can I get you another drink, Mr. Norton?
Come down right
Playboy Club closes and
You didn't tell her how much applause she got on it?
Anyway, Milt, who was indeed a very intimidating animator, and everybody was afraid of Milt because he was, you know, he would have these tantrums and he would yell and shout and scream. But Milt Call wasn't really the scariest of the 9 Old Men. The guy who really terrified me was Frank Thomas, because Frank, unlike boisterous Milt, Frank was kind of a sweet old guy, and he'd kind of talk like this. And he would say, Floyd, I got that scene you did yesterday, and I just looked at it, and it wasn't very good. I want you to do it over, because you really, you know, screwed it up. So that was Frank. Frank scared the dickens out of me. And so even when his son, Ted Thomas, who's a good friend, I said, Ted, every time I hear your voice, you sound like your dad, and you scare the hell out of me. I was really afraid of your father, because man, Frank was tough. The other 9 Old Men, I had a chance to work with Wooly Reiterman. He was my director on Jungle Book. I worked with Ward Kimball. Boy, what a guy. Yeah, Ward.
There you go.
yeah, the engineer Ward. That was really, I mean, Ward was my hero. I mean, I think my favorite animator. So I got a chance to assist Ward Kimball a little bit. But just to be there during that era of Disney's Nine Old Men, when all of them were still there working. Mark Davis, I watched him start out doing sketches on what eventually became Pirates of the Caribbean at Disneyland. Mark was almost right next door to me, and I remember he was always drawing pirates, you know, sketches of pirate ships and pirates. What's this for? Had no idea what he was doing. He was just drawing pirates every day. So it was an incredible time, and I feel so fortunate to have had the opportunity to work with these incredible guys, John Lounsbury, Ollie Johnson, Mark Davis. Good heavens, they were Disney's best, and to be there with them during that time for a young kid like me, because I was just a kid in my early 20s, to work with these guys was just, you know, I mean, you couldn't ask for more than that.
What was that Ward
Well,
story?
I actually have a story when there were just 7 old men. But I spent at least 2 months sequestered in a suite of offices with Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnson when they were doing the book, you know, Disney Art, The Illusion of Life, the big Abbeville press book. Because I had an ability as a forger. And they were not going to send the original animation art that was going to be in the book. It was all Xeroxes. And my job was to sit with fine pen points and correct all the lines that the xerography process couldn't capture from the original pencils. And the nicest thing that Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnson ever said to me was, "Boy, could we have used you in the old days."
As an inker.
Yeah. And of course, I was so glad to get away from inking. I think in all my time on staff at the studio, I may have inked 4 things. I got to draw. And then the 7 years I spent with the Disney store, I worked at home. They bought everything I drew, whether they produced it or not. And, but as I say, I can't say I was a Disney artist for 21 years. I drew Disney art for 21 years. Because you have to be on staff to say you were a Disney artist.
Really?
Oh yeah, it's that technicality.
It's that blue badge thing, isn't it?
And no, yeah, when I left the staff job, I could no longer get into the park for free, or I can handicap and take 3 people with me. I could no longer, I didn't have the blue background on my card, so I couldn't get stuff at the park for 30%.
Let me see that. Let me see that. Hang on a second. I was working on Mickey and the Three Musketeers, and he came in, and he'd just become Lloyd Norman, Disney legend. He said, "Don't call me that. God, I hate it." That is real. Yeah. Because the problem was, he wasn't upset about the Disney legend. Because I said, "What are you so upset about?" He said, walking around, said, "Well, this," and he showed me the card. That's awesome. I said, "Well, why are you upset about getting your blue badge back?" And he's like, "Well, there's the one I was using." And he made a fake ID and been getting on the lot for years. I don't know. I just don't feel like I'm cheating anybody anymore. I felt like I was getting away with something back then.
Well, I still have a really sharp photostat of my employee card. Maybe I should do some Photoshop. We used to get at least 3 times a year a packet of free passes to Disneyland with no expiration date.
Still do.
And of course, I was a good guy, and everybody I knew or didn't know that knew I worked at Disney was, "You got any passes?" So one time I had a stack of passes this big. Now I have 2 of them, and they're never leaving my hand because they're still, you know, they don't expire. But, you know, you figure, well, I'll get these things forever, so I'll give them away, you know. Now, my daughter who's out here, when I had the silver pass, and you could get in for free and take 3 people with you, would call me. I was in, I don't know if I was probably in Simi Valley, and she would call me from Winter and say, can you pick me and a couple of girlfriends up and take us to the park? And I would drive down, they'd park us. I'd walk in with them. Well, you know, anyway, those were the old days. What do I do with all of the Walt Disney Company credit cards I've got?
Go shopping.
I've got 14 of them.
Well, you know, it's somewhat unfortunate that we have the coveted blue employee card. You retire, it's good for a lifetime and all. But there's so many blackout dates now. What good is it? You know, 20th Century Fox and Lucas and Pixar and Marvel.
We got a workaround now. There's a way to get around that. No, I'll tell you about it, but there's a thing to avoid those.
Oh, okay. I want to know.
I've got a friend.
We got about 10 minutes. Any more questions? Any questions? We're gonna go, yes, sir.
Someone that tells them they have to take a test to be hired. Each of you had to do a test. What kind of test was it?
Well, in my case, I reported 8 o'clock that morning. I was a poor student, poor money-wise, and we used to have these Helms bakery trucks parked in front of the studio. So I would buy half a dozen donuts at 5 cents a piece, and I would have 2 for breakfast, and 2 for lunch, and 2 for dinner. I subsisted on Helms donuts. Well, anyway, I walk onto the studio, and I report to animation, and a fellow named Johnny Bond greeted me, sat me at an animation board with the light board, and he gave me a a model sheet. Cinderella, Alice in Wonderland, then Goofy, Mickey, Donald, and so you had 2 sets of characters, more or less straight, and then the cartoony. And so he says, okay, now draw these characters. Just because you're sitting at a light board, that doesn't mean you trace. You have to pose it and give it all kind of expressions and all. So I sat there and I did that, took the morning, and then I took a lunch break. And then when I came back, apparently I did well enough to be hired in the lady unit.
I'd help to have friends in the business. People who could tell you things. In 1960, I went to Los Angeles for a short time, and a buddy of mine who had gone to high school with, I told him I wanted to give this 11 by 14 portrait I'd done of Elvis to him, and he says, well, he's over at the set of Goldwyn Studios, and here's how you get on the lot. So I walked into the lot, pretended to punch a time card, waved at the security guy, walked down to the commissary, sat down and ordered a cup of coffee, and then I said, Elvis is on stage 5, right? And they said, it's 3, and I went, you're right. Then sauntered down to stage 3, the light's on, but you very quietly open the outer door, the inner door, and you just walk in and talk to Elvis for 2 hours, you know. Spent the day on the set of The Untouchables. It's just, if you have friends to tell you what to do, I didn't mean to segue, but it's the power of having friends in the right places.
Right. That's how I've gotten half the jobs, or actually 75% of the jobs I've gotten in the industry, mostly at Disney, have been that kind of thing. You get a call. I get a call from Lloyd, or I get a call from anybody. They're just, you know, right now someone's just like, well, Disney Features, like, we'd love to have you come back and do some work. Have you got a portfolio? I'm like, I haven't shown a portfolio in 30 years. I said, you want a portfolio? Turn the TV on. Raise your children. You know? And it's kind of hilarious. You know? It's just like, this stuff, it's all on paper. They're like, what's paper? Yeah.
What's paper? Next, there was another question. Yes, young lady.
Yes, I have a question for Floyd. Kind of simple one, but blue or pink dress? We gotta know.
Oh.
We went through this last year at Turner Classic Movies. We had a screening of Walt Disney's Sleeping Beauty at the Egyptian, I think, in Hollywood. And I was there with Jane Bear. Well, Jane Shada Takamoto Bear. Iwo's ex-wife. Remember? Anyway, we were discussing that final scene in Sleeping Beauty where we have this, you know, the fairies have this battle between what color should Aurora's dress be. You know, make it pink, make it blue, make it pink, make it blue. And we kept changing it as the prince and Aurora, you know, waltzed around the floor at the end of the film. And the dress kept changing colors. So I guess the big question is, what should the final color be? Well, I said blue and Jane said pink, but I don't think we'll ever know because the colors kept dissolving even as we did the fade out. So, you know, nobody really knows what final color ended up, you know, on, you know, Aurora's dress. Was it pink or blue? But, you know, fun stuff like that, you know, it's really, it's fun to have these arguments years later. I mean, it's like over 50 years ago and we are still arguing what color should Aurora's dress be. That's what I love about the cartoon business.
Thank
Next
you.
question. Next question. A couple more. Yes, young lady.
So I got one.
A good one.
So with Sleeping Beauty, there's like a difference with, like when you look at it, the backgrounds are amazing,
Edwin Earl.
right? And I was just like, wow. But you know, there was a whole different style with the characters, and I was like, was that something that was like set early on as well, that like dictated, you know, the film? Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, you know, keep in mind that Walt gave Ivan Earl carte blanche to design those marvelous backgrounds. I mean, the backgrounds in Sleeping Beauty are just incredible. They truly are, and Ivan Earl was basically the guy in charge of the art direction. Now, that posed somewhat of a problem for the animators because now the animation, which basically are flat drawings, have to work over those very ornate, you know, elaborate backgrounds. And so there was a good deal of consternation between the background department and the animation department during the production of Sleeping Beauty. The lead animators, you know, the 9 old men, were grumbling that the backgrounds were upstaging their animation. And so we had this controversy throughout production. And I remember one sequence, and it is sequence 8, where the prince meets Aurora in the forest, you know, and you probably remember that sequence, you know, where she sings Once Upon a Dream and the little animals scamper about. But the backgrounds were so beautiful, the word went out to Ivan and his background team. They had to tone down the backgrounds because they were actually so beautiful, so gorgeous, they were upstaging the animation. Now keep in mind, this was the 1950s, long before we had computer